Amen. All right, let's give our cooks a big hand today. And I don't know what it is about me being near this table, but it's just like haunting to me. Nobody will ever sit near me. I'm not sure what it is. So speaking of cooks and the men's advance, that may be some of the best crappie I've ever put in my mouth. Doug does a fantastic job, and whatever crew he has that is there of cooking that up. And I think when I left the men's advance last year, I weighed more than I've ever weighed in my life. The food all weekend is fantastic. It is something to behold if you haven't gotten to experience that. Let me give you a little bit of housekeeping thing. Apparently, I posted a duplicate teaching on the podcast. If you were trying to catch up last week, you got the one from the week before. That has been corrected as of this morning. So last week's is posted. So if you don't know about that, it's Dr. Pepper and Friends. You can find that on YouTube or Apple or Spotify if you miss and you want to catch up some week, and also on our Facebook Men of Fellowship Facebook page, Men of Fellowship Wednesday Morning Bible Study Facebook page. I try to post the link to that. And if you ever need the link and you can't find it, just get a hold of Mike or me or somebody, and I'll be glad to send it to you. So that's that. So this morning we're going to be in Genesis 23, and then we're going to move into 24 for just a few verses. I texted Van yesterday, and as I was kind of looking at this, there's only like 20 verses in chapter 23, and there's like 62 in 24. So Van's going to be teaching next week in Genesis 24, and I just said, hey, do you mind if I move on into it a little bit? And he said, yeah, that'd be great. So we're gonna take on just a little bit of 24. And I don't know if you've ever, I was just thinking about this, I don't know if you've ever tried to like start a fire with flint. Okay, but you get some really loose, dry grass if you can find it, and you get the flint going and into the grass, and then you kind of have to come down and put some little air on it, blow on it, or keep the wind from blowing it out, or something like that. That's almost the impression that I have with what God seems to be doing with Abraham and his family, trying to launch his people. It's almost like, okay, I got a little flame going with Abraham, and no, but he's about to go out. I don't know what's about to happen here. And then about the time we get to 23, we see this flame starting to grow just a little bit, and then we're going to see Sarah die in chapter 23. But then it picks back up in chapter 24 with Isaac, and we're going to see how this family begins to grow and how God's people began to finally populate the earth in a way that God maybe had intended for all along. So here is our discussion question for our tables a little bit later on today, okay, because we'll see as we look at the text how this plays out. But Abraham bought a grave in a land that he believed that his descendants would inherit, but he wouldn't live to see it, right? So he bought this land in a place where his family that had been promised to him would be able to inherit it. So the question is, where are you investing your life in something that you may never personally see fulfilled? Okay, where are you investing your life in something that you may never see come to fruition in your lifetime? And what does that tell us about the trust that we have in God's promises? Okay, so that's the question for this morning, and I'll repeat that again at the end. So before we jump into chapter 23, let's kind of recognize that this is probably the last episode of this story that we see that's starring Abraham. Okay, Abraham has kind of been the center character and the centerpiece of the story for really since chapter 12, and his journey is kind of coming to an end. We'll see a little bit more of him in the next chapter, but he's really kind of passing the torch to Isaac. So let's review a little bit of Abraham's life, because up to Genesis 23, we can trace his life through kind of a series of of callings and crises and covenants, and then God comes back and confirms the promises that he made to him. And if you look at Abraham's life, it's not a straight line upward. It's a long formation that has zigs and zags and detours and all kinds of things that it's not as clean as maybe when we can look at it when it's history. We look back on it and we see, yeah, Abraham believed and it was counted to him as righteousness. He's Father Abraham. But when you're kind of wading through this story with him, as we have since chapter 12, it's not nearly as clean. So in chapter 12, God calls Abram out of Ur, and he says, go from your country to a land where I'm going to show you. Leave your father's house, leave everything that's familiar to you, and just get up and go. And he did. All right. And then he makes this promise. He says, I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to make you great. Okay. And all the families of the earth are going to be blessed by you and through you. So this is kind of the foundation of the promise. There's land, there's offspring, there's blessing that God has promised to Abraham. But immediately, almost as soon as this promise is made, famine strikes the land, and Abram goes to Egypt. He tells Pharaoh that Sarah, his wife, is really his sister, and that whole scene kind of unfolds. It's this crisis of belief that we've talked about, that sometimes when God gives us a promise and we're looking to God to do something, there's something that happens that causes us to doubt that and to question that. So by Genesis 13, you have Abraham and Lot, and he allows Lot to choose where he's going to go. And Lot lifts up his eyes and he pitches his tent towards Sodom. Okay, and this is kind of a haunting line that we have in chapter 13. But Abram stays in Canaan, and he kind of God comes along and reiterates this promise to him. So by Genesis 14, Abram rescues Lot in this war that takes place in Genesis 14, and the king of Sodom's offers this reward that he turns down, but then he turns around and blesses is blessed by blesses Melchizedek blesses him, but he offers a tithe to Melchizedek. And then in Genesis 15, God kind of formalizes the covenant, the promise that he's made to him by this covenant ceremony that we see in chapter 15. But it really, even by chapter 16, we see Abram falling back into what he was really good at, which was kind of coming up with plan B, trying to figure out how he can help this promise along when it's not happening in the way that he thinks that it should. So Sarah gives Hagar to Abram. Ishmael is born. He's a real son, but he's not the promised son. He's not the son of the promise. And this kind of picture of impatience is what we see in 16. And then in Genesis 17, God reaffirms the covenant. He comes right along, and he's just fanning that flame just a little bit more. Okay, Abram, I've seen that you've departed and you've gone in a different direction. And he comes along, he begins to fan that flame, and he changes his name to Abraham. Okay, the father, not just father of a nation, but the father of multitudes. Okay, is the name that he gives him, and institutes circumcision as the sign. So we're going to revisit that just a little bit today in the text that we look at in chapter 24. So Sarah is also explicitly included in the promise. And when the promise happens, Abraham laughs, and then Sarah laughs. And this is just kind of setting the stage for the birth of Isaac that we see a little bit later. In Genesis 18, we see Abraham interceding boldly for Sodom. He's praying that God will have mercy because Lot is there. In Genesis 19, we see Sodom destroyed, Lot is rescued. And we kind of see the moral fracture of the whole region. We see what's really happening with all of these people in this area. And then in Genesis 20, Abraham repeats the same mistake that he did with Pharaoh with Abimelech. He tells Abimelech that this is Sarah is his sister, and he says, well, technically she actually is. She's my father's daughter and not my mother's daughter, and that still doesn't fly. Okay, so in Genesis 21, after decades of waiting, Isaac is finally born. Okay, laughter becomes joy in Abraham's household. and the promise becomes flesh and blood. And he's here, okay? But yet immediately the household divides, and you see Hagar and Ishmael being sent away in the middle of all that. But God comes and he cares for them in the middle of the wilderness. And Abraham secures this covenant of peace with Abimelech at the end of that chapter of 21. And they plant a tree and they call on the name of the Lord as the everlasting God. So Abraham is recognizing God as the God of endurance, the God that sustains him over time. And this is the picture of Abraham's life that we've seen. And then in 22, we see Abraham facing the greatest test of his life of being called to offer Isaac as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. And he learns in that moment that God will provide. So the promise survives the knife, okay? Now, lots and lots and lots of high drama that we have in Abraham's life. I mean, this is a great action movie for the most part, up until 23. So in chapter 23, it's a little bit different, okay? It's not as dramatic. There's no big mountain test. There's no angel. There's no miraculous birth. There's no ram that's been caught in a thicket. Just death. Okay, is what we see in chapter 23. And that may be why this chapter turns out to be so important, because it asks us a different kind of question than chapter 22. In chapter 22, we were asked, really, will you trust God with what you love the most? Okay, and this is what we saw with, will you trust God to provide when God has called you to take out and slaughter your son, your only son? In Genesis 23, asks a different kind of question, is will you trust God when what you love dies, right? And this is faith at graveside. This is something that for us as men, it speaks deeply to some things that we just walk through in life that we'd prefer not to. But one of the things that you can be guaranteed of in this life is that you will lose people that you love. And we see how Abraham walks through this. So let's jump in chapter 23 and verse 1. So Sarah lived 127 years, and these were the years of Sarah's life. Now, this is an interesting Bible trivia fact here, okay? Sarah is the only woman in Scripture, okay, that we know of, or that I know of, whose full lifespan is recorded. There are a lot of other women that you find in Scripture that we, drop in and we have, scenes from their life. But Sarah is probably the only person that we know of that her entire lifespan is something that's recorded. And Wenham notes that this just kind of is an indication of her covenant significance, okay? That in the covenant, it was something that Abraham was a part of that covenant, and it wasn't just that Sarah was a bystander, but she was someone that the covenant passed through in addition to Abraham. It wasn't just through Abraham's seed, but the covenant also passed through her. So we see all of her life recorded. Verse 2. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Now I want us to kind of see something here. I mean, strong men express emotion. And we see this in Abraham's response to Sarah's death. There is nothing that's necessarily strong about stuffing it and keeping it all in. You would expect to hear this from a counselor, okay? So just take on my little soapbox for a moment, all right? But Abraham weeps, okay? I'm not going to linger with that. But Abraham weeps, and the writer is clear to point this out. So the man who trusted God with Isaac also weeps for Sarah. So weeping and expressing emotion is not a sign of weak faith. It's something that coexists with strong faith, right? He trusted God, but he also wept. I mean, Jesus trusted God, but he also wept. Look at the Psalms, okay? It is just it's filled with an expression of emotion, whether it's David or it's Moses or it's others. I mean, it's completely a right brain book when it comes to being able to see how God's people and people who had great faith also expressed emotion, right? So faith is not something that eliminates grief. It is good. It is proper that when we lose someone that we love, that we express the emotion that goes along with that. So Holman in the commentary, the Holman Bible commentary, points out that Scripture never portrays strong men as emotionally detached. All right, we see the strength of men, including mourning, including the expression of sorrow at times. All right, verse 3. And Abraham rose up from before his dad and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Now, this to me is just mind-blowing. It's kind of staggering. The man who's been promised the land, okay, calls himself a foreigner in the land, right? I'm not sure at this point, we can count it up, exactly. He's been there for decades, okay? But he's basically saying to the Hittites, I'm an outsider here, right? I've mentioned this before, but I was a pastor of a little country church for a few years early on, in my late 20s, early 30s. And we had a guy that had been at the church for several decades. His wife had died. He married a woman in the church whose husband had died. And he'd probably been there 20 years, something like that. And the conversation came up about possibly approaching him to serve as a deacon in the church. And I sat down with him and talked with him, and he said something that really surprised me. He said, I still feel like an outsider here. I feel, like I'm the new guy. And I'm like, but you've been here 20 years. I've been here 3. And he said, yeah, but that's still kind of the way that I feel. And apparently this is kind of where Abraham was coming from. He still felt like he was imposing. He was a sojourner. He was somebody that was really a tourist. He was a visitor in this land. So he approaches someone about where he might be able to bury his wife, right? So Dr. Constable kind of points out this tension that, Abraham, even though this is the land that's been promised to him, he owns none of it, okay? He doesn't own anything. So the promise is not failed, but it's still a part of that flame that's being fanned. It's just not being completely fulfilled just yet. So the Hittites respond in verse 5 with honor here. They say, they answered Abraham. They said, "Hear us, my Lord. You are a prince of God among us. Okay, bury your dad in the choicest of tombs." Okay, this is their response to him. So they recognize God's favor on Abraham. But Abraham really, he kind of insists on ownership. He bows respectfully, and he even requests a very specific cave. Look at verse 7. So Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land, and said to them, "If you're willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat me, Ephron, son of Zohar, for the full price. Let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place." So this was something that Abraham was wanting. He was wanting to purchase it. He wasn't wanting any favors. He wanted really kind of uncontested possession because he needed it to be his. This is where he was going to bury his wife. He wasn't looking for charity. He wasn't looking for kind of shades of gray of just kind of, we're going to look this way, you bury your wife wherever you want to. He didn't want to be obliged to anybody. He didn't want to be dependent on anybody. And then this kind of begins the negotiation. So we look in verse 11, and Ephron responds, and this is a public conversation that's taking place. He says, "No, my Lord, hear me. I will give you the field. Bury your dead." Okay? Now, this sounds really courteous, and it sounds like kindness, but it's actually probably the beginning of a negotiation. All right? It's not necessarily the way that it seems. And Abraham understands this. So in verse 12, then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. He said, "I give the price of the field, accept it from me." And then we see the price named in the next verse. So a piece of land is worth, about 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me, right? So it's this kind of really kind, honoring negotiation between two people who are fairly honorable people, but it's not what it might have seemed. It really wasn't that Ephron was going to give it to him, or that he even wanted to, as much as that was a courtesy that he was throwing out there so that Abraham could counter with his offer to actually buy the land. And then they named the price. And if you look at the going rate of real estate in that day and time, it might have been a little bit steep. I don't know that it would be exactly gouging, but it would have been a little bit inflated on the high end. But Abraham doesn't argue. He comes on in verse 16 and he says he weighed out for Ephron the silver, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants, right? So publicly, formally, completely, there's no question about, if there's any backroom kind of deal or anything like that. He just pays the man. Okay, so the field of Ephron in verse 17 in Machpelah was made over to Abraham as a possession. Okay, so finally, after in verse 19, after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah. In the field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. So this chapter ends with kind of this legal certainty of Abraham now owns something. Okay, he owns something in the land that's been promised to him, and this is the first piece of land that he owns in the promised land that God has given to him, and it's a grave. Okay, this is what he owns. And so the promise being fulfilled actually begins with a burial to the land that I will show you. The first thing that he actually owns in it is the tomb of his wife. Okay, so the Bible Project kind of highlights this and talks about how Abraham believes that his descendants will inherit the land, yet he personally only owns a tomb. All right, okay. You look on and you see other places in the Bible. Hebrews 11 talks about this a little bit, that this is the kind of faith that acknowledges that Abraham was a stranger and an exile on the earth. And Genesis 23 just teaches us that covenant faith it's a long game. Okay, it's a long horizon kind of faith. So even though the land was promised in Genesis 12, Abraham is invested in a ground that he's never going to get to farm. He's never really going to get to own. All he owns is the place where his wife has been laid to rest. D.A. Carson talks about this. He says that biblical hope is not optimism about circumstances. It's a confidence in God's promises beyond death. Right. So when you think about the promise being fulfilled, okay, and really Abraham moving into this promised land and living there, being a sojourner, that was kind of the deposit that had been laid down. But the promise fulfilled was something that he wouldn't really get to completely see in his lifetime. And that's kind of the journey that we walk too. I mean, we have a promise that has been given to us of eternal life, and we're walking in this earth as sojourners, okay? We're aliens, we're foreigners in this land. And there is a promise on the other side of the grave that has to do with the fulfillment that's a complete fulfillment. There is fulfillment of the promise even by the giving of the Holy Spirit in our life. But there is a promise that is to be complete on the other side of the grave. So that's kind of what Abraham models. He weeps, he stands, he buys this land in faith instead of returning her to his homeland, which would have been something that you might do if you are traveling in another country. It might be something that you want to have your funeral service and burial back in the land that you came from. But he's like, I've burned the sails. I'm not going back to the other land. This is the land where I'm supposed to be. All right, so that kind of brings us to the end of chapter 23. So let's move on to chapter 24, because this is where the story picks back up. So the flame starts to get fanned just a little bit more. In verse 1 of chapter 24, now Abraham was old. He was well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Okay, now the word blessed here doesn't necessarily mean that he's made Abraham's life easy. It just means that he's been covenantally sustained. Okay, this is what God has done in Abraham. In verse 2, and Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh. Now, we've visited this before. I think there was another thing that we were studying, maybe in Romans last year, where we wound up talking about this a little bit. That's an odd request, isn't it? Okay, but I want to tell you, I've lived on this life now for 61 years, and I think I am just now starting to understand the significance of circumcision. Okay, because is this request is being made. So he's got this servant, he's wanting to take an oath. Okay, and the way that he's asking this servant to take an oath is to put his hand under his thigh. Well, what does that really even mean? Okay, well, he's asking him to put his hand near the circumcision. He's asking him to put his hand near the organ of generativity, okay, near the organ of generations. Okay, this is actually what he's requesting him to do. And it's not sexual, it's not even really gross. It would seem that way maybe to us at this stage of the game. But if the thing that you'll remember, what was the whole point of circumcision? What circumcision represented was God's promise for Abraham to be the father of many nations. And I think for us, as we've walked this journey with Abraham, that makes more sense now. Because I think as we walked through chapter by chapter since chapter 12, and even as we kind of went through that review a little bit earlier on, we feel the angst and the anticipation that Abraham had to have had of, okay, you've made this promise, no kids. You've made this promise, no kids. You've made this promise, no kids. Is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with her? I mean, these had to have been questions that he was asking for decades, right? But God's promise is that you will reproduce through Sarah, and this will be the child of promise, right? So this was the promise that God had made. And day after day, month after month, year after year, they held on, no babies, okay? But then finally Isaac is born. And this precious, spark lit up into a flame in this moment. And the reproduction that leads to Abraham actually being the father of the multitudes of nations has finally gotten started. So when Abraham says, put your hand under my thigh, be near the circumcision, I'm acknowledging that this is not just an oath that you're making to me, but this is an oath that you're making to God. And this is the significance of this carries the weight of the promise that I've been living out and waiting on for the last several decades. This is how serious this promise is to me. It's as serious as my ability to reproduce. In many ways, is kind of what he's asking this guy to do. So he says, put your hand under my right thigh in verse 3. That I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the earth. So this is solemn theology, okay, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites. Okay, so no intermarrying. This is to be a pure marriage that takes place. So he's making the servant swear that he's not going to help him out in any kind of way by allowing him to hook up with one of the Canaanite women. So this covenant line is something that can't dissolve into a form of idolatry, which it would have been had he married a Canaanite. So no compromise in all of this. But you will go to my country, in verse 4, you will go to my country and to my kindred. Okay, now you notice he's sending the servant here. Okay, he's not sending Isaac. Abraham himself is not going back to the homeland to find a wife for him. He's making the servant promise this. And he says that, perhaps, or the servant kind of pushes back a little bit and says, okay, I'll go to the homeland, but what if I come up and I find somebody and I say, hey, there's this guy and he lives way far away and he's looking for a wife and I need you to go with me. Okay. Seems like a kind of crazy request, right? So the servant is recognizing this, and he says, well, what if she pushes back? In verse 5, perhaps the woman may not be willing, okay? Must I then take your son back? In other words, what if she wants to see the guy before she marries him, right? Maybe not a bad request. I mean, she might want to at least meet him, okay? And now that's probably sounds much more radical to us than it might have during that day. I mean, it wasn't as uncommon to have some kind of arranged marriage where the parents or the fathers of two children put them together, sometimes even for political purposes. But the servant asks her a pretty reasonable question. Okay, what if she says no? What if she says, I want to see this guy first? And so do I take Isaac with me at that point? And Abraham said to him in the next verse, in verse 6, see to it that you do not take my son back there. That's interesting. That's an interesting request. In fact, it's kind of showing us a little bit of Abraham's maturity at this point. Okay, why was it important why do you think it was important for Isaac to not go back to the land? Yeah, so he was needing to stay put where God told him to be. What'd you say, Steve?
I just said he didn't want him to stay down there.
Okay, yeah, he didn't want him to stay there. All right, so yeah, I mean, Genesis 15, when you look at this, I mean, God formalized the covenant in Genesis 15, okay, and he was even specific about the land boundaries. And in the land of Canaan that Abraham and Isaac were living in, that was not incidental. That was covenant territory. This was where Abraham knew that he was called to be. In Genesis 17, I mean, this land, even though Abraham only owns a tomb at this point, okay, this land is described as an everlasting possession. So the land itself was kind of important. And if Isaac leaves the land, then covenant geography is compromised in this. Okay, so this is a part of the land is a part of the covenant promise. And you see early on Abraham fled famine, but mature Abraham refuses to retreat at this point. Okay, he's only going to advance, Mike. Okay, that's what he's going to do, right? So verse 7, the Lord who swore to me, to your offspring, I will give this land. He will send his angel before you. So we see Abraham now having confidence in what God's going to do. He's saying, I've got all the confidence in the world that when you go to select a wife, this is going to be somebody that is going to be persuaded, because there's going to be an angel that goes before you, and God's going to handle this. Okay, this is what he's saying in verse 20, in verse 7. So in verse 8, but if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath. Only you must not take my son back there. All right. So no compromise on geography. In verse 9. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, and he makes this promise. All right. So the oath is sealed. Okay. Now we move on. The story kind of picks up here in verse 10. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed. Now, how many camels? 10. Let's remember that, because we're going to come back to that in a minute. Okay. So 10 camels tells us, man, they filled up with gas and they put a few gas cans in the back of the truck. Okay. This is going to be a long journey. All right. So 10 camels means they're going to be at it for a while. All right. So he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. So you remember wells, okay? So we talked a little bit about wells in a previous chapter. What do wells represent? Yeah, it was a meeting place. It represented sustainability. And often it was a place where covenants would take place. There was a covenant transaction or transition that would take place there. But wells were kind of a sign of security, a sign of sustainability, okay? And then there's this prayer, okay, that we see in verse 12. O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. So the servant is offering this prayer, and he's using covenant language, this steadfast love. The word hesed is the word that's used here. Maybe an enduring kind of love, all right? So let the young woman to whom I shall say, please let your jar down that I may drink, who shall say, drink and I will water your camels, let her be the one. Okay, now this is a crazy kind of request. He's laying out some golden fleece here, okay? He's saying, if I come across this woman, I need you to do me a favor here, Lord. I need you to let her offer, I want to ask her for a drink of water, and I need her response to be, I'm going to give you a drink of water, but I want to water your camels too. Okay, that was his request. All right. So in verse, so he's really asking not just for beauty, but he's asking for character. But let's look at verse 15. So before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah. Okay, so we see almost by the time he's getting the last line of his prayer answered or out, by the time he's getting the last line of his prayer out, this woman appears, Rebekah appears, okay? And it says that the young woman was very attractive in appearance, A maiden whom no man had known, she went down to the spring and filled up her jar, and she came up. Okay, so this covenant begins to take up a little bit of speed. It begins to move forward. So the servant runs out to greet her, and he says, please give me a little water from to drink from your jar. And she said, drink, my lord. And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. And when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw water for your camels also until they finish drinking. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, and she ran again to the well to draw water, and she drew for all of his camels. And the man gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered in his journey or not. So the servant runs out to meet her. He doesn't hesitate. He's like, oh, maybe there she is. He engages her pretty immediately, and you kind of see this urgency with the servant, but also with Rebecca, because you see words like, she hurried. I mean, she responded quickly in the middle of all this, and she didn't really have much presumption. She wasn't questioning a whole lot. So he asks her for a little water, and that's a reasonable request. Now, I don't know if you've thought about it. I mean, when you think about how really kind of out of the ordinary it is for her to offer to water the camels, but I've never fed a camel. I've never given a camel anything to drink. Okay, but we talk about this sometimes. It's a part of our language. Man, I'm as thirsty as a camel. Okay, if a camel has been going for many days' journey and they haven't had any water, they're probably pretty thirsty. You want to take a guess at about how much it would take to refuel a camel? How much water? 2.5 gallons per camel. Okay, that may be the case. Where what I'd read was like 20 to 30 gallons, so 10 times that. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. No, I think it was 20 to 30 gallons per camel. But I don't know my camels. Okay, what? 10 gallons a hump. I'll take that. It was a lot of water. Okay, this was a big request. She would have probably had to have gone back and forth in many times to get all the camels watered at this point. But she says, I'll draw water for your camels also. So this is for 10 camels. Okay, this is a lot of work that she's signing up for, and she's volunteering for this. She wasn't asked to do this, and it's not just symbolic politeness. I mean, it would be polite for her to offer water to the people, but usually the people would be responsible for taking care of their own animals in this case. So this is not necessarily charm. This is showing us something about who this woman is, because she's volunteering to do this without being asked to do this. So the sign that the servant prayed for is unfolding exactly as he had asked, right before his eyes, without him having to do much prompting. Okay. And then verse 20, so she quickly emptied her jar and she ran again. Okay, so quickly ran. Okay, this is an eager generosity that she is offering to them. And the Bible kind of points out that Genesis, the Bible Project points out that Genesis reveals character sometimes through action instead of, just description. So we're seeing her character in action. And in her suitability is not just her appearance, but it's the person that she is. It's her hospitality. It's the initiative, but it's also right in line with the prayer that the servant had been asking. And then in verse 21 is kind of almost the theological center of something. This is I love verse 21 because it says the man just gazed at her in silence. Okay, I mean, he's just in awe. And this may be one of the most mature moments that we see in this entire chapter. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't jump in and say, "This is it. I'm taking you back to Canaan." He doesn't, rush that process. He just watches, and he just remains quiet and just stands in awe of what God is doing in this moment. And probably just this signals a certain discernment. He's discerning what's happening right in front of him, and he's going back maybe and saying, now, what was it I prayed, and what is it that I'm seeing? Let me make sure that I'm understanding this and processing this and discerning this well. And he's kind of waiting to confirm what, if what he's seeing is truly God's provision for him. Just letting that sit, letting that settle just a little bit. And this is kind of just an example of a faith that has been formed. We see Abraham earlier who panicked when he was in Egypt, and he engineered the whole thing with Hagar. But now his household, which is the servant, is just demonstrating this prayerful observation. And guys, it has taken me 61 years, but I'm starting to learn how to do this. I'm not there yet, okay? But I'm kind of that ready, fire, aim kind of guy a lot of the time. Instead of taking aim, ready, aim, fire. I'm kind of ready, fire, aim. Let's shoot. Let's get this show on the road. Okay, that's my tendency, is to rush into things sometimes. And it's clear for those that know me. I try to do too many things. Okay, but this guy's just sitting there, and he's just asking, internally, is this a coincidence? Or is this God? Is this covenant faithfulness? Is really the work of God that I'm seeing? He's allowing that to just sit and settle in his spirit. D.A. Carson says that the biblical providence is often recognized retrospectively. Okay, we look back and we see God's hand only after we've paid attention patiently over time. Right. So this prayer is being answered as the servant watches, and the servant that asked for the woman who would water the camels, there she is. He's standing there watching her water these camels. And he lets obedience just kind of complete itself. And that's just spiritual maturity in the middle of all of that. I have shared this story before, but there's a second part to it I'll share. The question is, God still do this? And I think I've shared the story about my son and his wife getting married. But Luke 1:52 or 2:52, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. That was the life verse that I had prayed for my boys since they were in the womb. Okay, I prayed that for them almost every day, not every day, but almost every day. But just that they would grow in wisdom and grace and favor with God and man. Wisdom, stature, and favor with God and man. Wisdom and grace. That was the prayer. Repeated over and over and over again. And both boys were pretty wise about dating as they were in high school. They didn't date a lot. They went on some dates, but really, and they were very interesting girls, but they were all also interested in sports and fishing and a lot of other things. By the time they get to college, neither of them had really had a serious girlfriend, but my oldest wound up with a serious girlfriend for about a year, and we kind of both know, when your parents, she's probably not the one, we just kind of knew that. We didn't say that or imply that or cast that out to anybody, but still, I'm praying wisdom, grace, wisdom, God give them wisdom and grace in the middle of all this. And then graduated college. My oldest graduated college. And was working at Union for a little while, and he said, "Hey, I've got a date with somebody tonight," and they went out on a date, and he came back after the second date, and he said, "Dad, I really think she's the one." I said, "Really?" I said, "Okay." Well, the end of the story is that they've now been married for about 11 years, and couple of cool little factors in that. One is, remember, I've been praying for wisdom and grace and wisdom all that time. Guess what her name was? Gracie Wise. That was her name. Her name was Gracie Wise. I'm not kidding. Can't make that up. And if you've heard that part of the story, you haven't heard this part of the story. The other part of the story was that she had never had a boyfriend. Okay, she had never had a boyfriend. She was graduating. She graduated that following year from Union. She had been on some dates, but my son Jordan was the first person that she ever was in a romantic relationship with. And he didn't know this until much later on. But her prayer all along, I tear up talking about this, her prayer all along, and it's going to be silly when I say it, was that when the one came, the one that she was supposed to marry came, that he would take her to a bookstore because she loves to read. To this day, she loves to read. Guess where he took her? Books A Million. That was their first date, right? To Books A Million. So I don't know. Coincidence, I've sat with that in my spirit for 11 years now, okay, but it's still something that God does when we and I wasn't praying for a Gracie Wise. I was just praying that God would give him wisdom and grace and favor with God and man, and I've seen God be faithful to answer some of that. I want us to think, just kind of close this out just a little bit real quickly, just about how there's a trajectory that we see in this. So Genesis 23 begins with a burial. And Genesis 24 moves toward a bride for the son of promise, okay? In the Old Testament, we see that death doesn't cancel the covenant. The son now requires a bride. And the servant goes out to gather her, and the bride responds and journeys to meet the son. But look at how this trajectory moves forward in the New Testament. The son dies, okay? The covenant continues. The Spirit gathers a bride, and there's a wedding that awaits. This is not an allegory, okay, as much as this is a trajectory. It's a foreshadowing of the story of God and his people. There's this burial and a bride, and there's this grave, and then there's this covenant expansion through the resurrection of Jesus. So we come to kind of the end of Abraham's story here. We'll see a little bit more of him. But he's been called, he's been faithful at times, he's been fearful at times, he's been impatient at times, he's been renewed at times, he's been fulfilled at times, he's been tested at times, but he's been anchored beyond death. And this little flame that we were hoping would start to catch a little bit is finally starting to have a little bit of a blaze to it. So the promise is something that survives grief and outlives a generation and moves on to this next generation. So that's what we see, is this generational kind of faith. All right. So let's kind of think about our tabled discussion question. And that's, what have you invested in that's going to outlive you, basically? Okay. So we see Abraham bought a grave in a land that he wouldn't really ever own other than the tomb itself. And what is something that you're investing in that you may never personally see bear fruit? But what does that reveal for anybody about the trust that we have in God's promises? All right. So have that conversation at your table, and we're going to continue with the romantic. It's not a romantic comedy, but it's a romantic story next week with Van.